Okay, we started the topic of fluent speech last week because a number of pronunciation changes take place when people speak English fluently. And I'm going to repeat the first set and then move on to those that I didn't complete last week. Now, the slides that were on the handout last week, I have just repeated them on the handout this week. So you don't need last week's handout. I've included them again, basically. The first point was that we're studying three different types of pronunciation changes. There are those that occur due to syllabification. What that means is the process of grouping segments together into words around the sonority peak, creating syllables by grouping segments around a sonority peak often triggers some changes in pronunciation. And the ones we studied already last week were linking, gliding, and vowel length. The consonant at the end of a word, followed by a word beginning with a vowel, that consonant and vowel are pronounced together as a syllable. That's linking. We link words together by joining a word final consonant and a word initial vowel and pronounce them together as a single syllable. Gliding was similar, except that the word final segment is not a consonant, but rather a vocalic approximant, either a glide or a high vowel, and then the next word begins with a vowel. But again, it links together the words in speech. But in this case, we actually add an additional segment. We add a glide. And vowel length was the tendency to lengthen the duration of the vowel pronunciation when the final consonant is voiced. Voiceless and voiced consonants at the end trigger different vowel durations. We have longer vowel pronunciations before a voiced consonant than a voiceless consonant. We won't review the examples, but I just want to remind them. We saw two processes triggered by stress, basically unstressed. Unstressed syllables weaken the vowel through vowel reduction, and they weaken alveolar stops through flapping. And we'll see some examples today, but we won't review all of them. And the last group we started, but did not finish, were those processes due to segmental adjacency. That means that the two segments are next to each other in the sequence of segments in a word, or even across words. We began looking at assimilation, and I will repeat the examples of assimilation, and then move on to blending and deletion, which are two more processes. So like I say, we saw vowel reduction, which to remind you is any vowel, whether it's high or low, front or back, tense or lax, any vowel can become schwa when it appears in an unstressed syllable. Flapping is a similar kind of segmental weakening, but it's not affecting vowels, it's affecting the consonants t and d. T and d become a tap or a flap pronunciation when they are followed by an unstressed vowel. So B-O-D-Y, ba-di, is not pronounced ba-di, but rather ba-di, body, body. And it's a very, very common property of North American English. There are other varieties of English that don't include flapping, but it is often heard. And then we looked at segmental adjacency. And here's where I want to begin repeating from last week. The first one is assimilation, where a segment changes to become similar to an adjacent segment. Blending, two segments that are near one another blend together into a single segment that shares properties of the two original segments. Usually the place of articulation from one of them and the manner of articulation from the other blend together into a single segment. And then finally, deletion. There are several cases where segments are deleted when in certain sequences. And we'll look at those in detail today. Okay, so last week I pointed out that this long word assimilation has in the middle of it the word similar. So assimilate means to make similar or to become similar. So assimilation refers to the process in which sounds become similar to adjacent sounds. And we saw last week that the plural S in English, but the other S suffixes as well. Apostrophe S, like John's book, or the S at the end of verbs, the third person singular present tense S, undergoes exactly the same allophony, the same kind of change, voicing assimilation. And if the S follows a voiced segment, as it does in dog, G is voiced, sonorants are all voiced, so the N at the end of can, ul is a sonorant, at the end of car, and bay, which is a vowel. All of those are going to have a Z pronunciation, a voiced alveolar fricative, right? Bays. Bays, cars, bells, cans, dogs, and if the word ends with a voiceless segment, like it does in dock and lip and cat, then the plural is pronounced s with a voiceless alveolar fricative. Right? So it's because of the adjacent segment. Right? It's to become similar in voicing to the adjacent segment. We also have cases of place assimilation. We also saw this last week. And this is not the only example. It's just one of several examples. But we have this prefix in, which means not, which can attach to roots to create negative words. So audible, I choose the word audible because it begins with a vowel. If it begins with a vowel, then you can be sure that the N sound is part of the prefix and not changed because of place assimilation. So inaudible is something that can't be heard, but the N is pronounced as an alveolar nasal. But if the root it attaches to is possible, well then it becomes impossible. It's pronounced as a bilabial nasal. Or in complete, the K sound is velar, so the nasal is also pronounced velar. The difference between voicing assimilation and place assimilation is which feature changes. Voicing assimilation only changes the voicing. The place of articulation remains unchanged. In place assimilation, it's only the place of articulation that changes. The voicing and the manner, usually, remain unchanged. We also saw cases of place assimilation that target the alveolar stops. So T and D, the alveolar stops, are the weakest segments and often undergo changes in fluent speech. And we can see these cases where they undergo place assimilation. So right ends in an alveolar stop, right place, right, becomes right place. Now it's much easier to say, and it helps you to avoid a common error. So learners, when they first start learning English, might have a tendency to say something like raito place. Raito. You want to say the T, right? Raito. But there is no T. The T disappears and becomes part of the following segment, right place. So you don't need to say the T. Right place shows us that the two sounds that are both voiceless stops become the same segment. Whereas in white bird, bird is a voiced bilabial stop. The T becomes a P. It does not become a B. The only feature that changes is the place of articulation. Since the t is a stop, it remains a stop. Since the t is voiceless, it remains voiceless. And it becomes white bird, white bird. And even before the nasal m becomes not me. It does not become nasal, it does not become voiced, it only changes its place of articulation. And we see that this targets not only t before p, but also t before k. So white coat becomes white coat, that girl becomes that girl. And the bottom row shows the voiced alveolar stops undergoing the same place of articulation. Hard path becomes hard path. Good boy becomes good boy. Good morning becomes good morning. And before the velar stop, g, bad, cold becomes bad cold. And red gate becomes red gate. And we also see it in front of the nasals. We see the nasals undergo the change. So the alveolar nasal becomes labial or velar to match the place of articulation of the following consonant. So gone past becomes gone past. Gone back becomes gone back. 10 men becomes 10 men. It's a way of linking together the words, having them share their place of articulation, which makes the speech more fluent and more connected. Now we'll start with the topic we didn't get to last week, which is blending. There are some cases where two segments that become adjacent, because they're next to one another, they blend together into a single segment. And you may have studied these. They're often included as pronunciation exercises in language textbooks. But met, you, the word met, ends in a voiceless alveolar stop, t, the T sound. You begins with a palatal glide, y. So in slow, careful speech, I might pronounce met you, met you. But in fluent speech, the two segments get blended together into the palatal affricate ch, met you, met you. The same pronunciation as the word chew, like I'm chewing my food, chew, is part of the pronunciation of met you. I think I met you last week, met you. So it becomes a single segment. And it's not only the voiceless t, but also the voiceless d in could, followed by you, becomes could you, could you, could you help me? And so the two segments become one, and they are blending together properties of each original segment. Notice that the palatal affricate has the place of articulation of the y, of the word initial glide, y. It's palatal. But it has the manner of articulation. It's a voiceless obstruent, the t. Now, you might expect it to be a stop because the T is a stop, but English has no palatal stops. So the closest available segment is the palatal affricate, met you, met you. So blending really means blending together the features of different segments. So the T plus Y becomes Ch, the D plus Y becomes J. That's blending. Deletion occurs quite a lot in fluent English speech. And we'll see several examples. And again, it's the alveolar stops that are generally the target of these fluent speech processes. We fail to pronounce, we ignore, we skip the T sound when it's between a fricative and another consonant. So that's 3 consonants in a row. If there's a fricative, followed by a T, followed by another consonant, that T doesn't get deleted. So it doesn't get pronounced, it's deleted. So last time, there's a S, T, T. I don't pronounce the middle T, just last time. Last time we heard that. Last time. Not last time, but last time. Fast bus. So even if they have different places of articulation, the T at the end of fast is often deleted when the next word begins with a consonant. A fast bus. Fast bus. I don't say the T. Best man. When you're at a wedding, there's a bride and a groom. The bride has her maid of honor, and the groom has his best man. Best man. The T gets deleted. First night, the first night of our vacation. First night means first. West side, the west side of New York. My best friend. Not besto friendo, besto. You want to say the T, but we don't. Basically, there's too many consonants together, so the weak alveolar stop undergoes deletion. Lift boy, we don't use this word anymore. It basically is the old term for an elevator operator. So before elevators had their own buttons for customers to press, there used to be an attendant who operated the elevator. Elevators in England are called lifts, or normally I would say lifts. I don't say the T, right? Lifts. Right? A lift boy was the young operator who did. Stuffed chicken becomes stuffed chicken, like the T, even though that's kind of an important sound because it makes clear it's past tense or past participle used as an adjective. It becomes stuffed chicken. Stuffed chicken. So chicken that is stuffed with maybe ham and cheese or vegetables, I don't know. Stuffed chicken. Soft mattress. So even if the next consonant is a nasal, we still have deletion of T. Soft T, soft mattress. My left knee. My right knee, my left knee. Okay. Left shoe, my left shoe. Soft snow. Soft snow. Right? Soft snow. The T does not get pronounced. So the general principle is T between a fricative before it and any kind of consonant after it will undergo deletion. Another example, we delete D when it's between a nasal and a voiced consonant. So the T and the D is also an alveolar stop, so it's one of the weak stops. So we see it in cases like blind man. The D of blind gets deleted. Blind man. In fact, blind man then places the nasal N before the bilabial M, which then triggers place assimilation. We get blind man. Blind man. But we'll add that later. Kind nurse. It's not kind nurse, just kind nurse. Kind nurse. Tinned beans becomes tin beans. Tin beans. Stand guard. Again, stand guard triggers the deletion of the D, so it becomes stand. But guard begins with a velar stop. So you'll see that the nasal also undergoes place assimilation to become the same place of articulation as the following voiced velar stop. Stand guard. Stand guard. So we're going to see several examples of interacting fluent speech processes. Some more examples. Skimmed milk becomes skim milk. And maybe you've noticed, like English, there's a beverage, a drink, iced tea. Iced tea was originally iced tea. And it's still sometimes spelled I-C-E-D space T-E-A. But you will also see just iced tea, I-C-E-T-E-A. They're exactly the same drink. It's just the more recent spelling has been to drop the D because nobody says the D. It's another example of the alveolar stop being deleted, iced tea. And we see skim milk is the same. Also between words in phrases, he seemed nice. He seemed nice. The D doesn't get pronounced. It seemed good. It seemed good. He climbed back. He climbed back means he climbed back. Now, if it was not past tense, well, then it would be he climbs back. The Z would be pronounced. But for I or you, there's no contrast between I climb back, I will climb back, and I climbed back. I climbed back. The D undergoes the deletion. Now, either T or D, both the voice and the voiceless consonant, gets deleted when surrounded by two stops. And you can understand why, because to hear a stop, you have to hear the vowel before it or the vowel after it. That's how you hear the stop. Otherwise, the stop is just silence. You're stopping the airflow. So in the word locked car, the T sound, the voiceless T, which is pronounced after a voiceless K for past tense, undergoes deletion. You get lock car. And it means the car that is locked. Strict parents, without the T. He stopped behind. So any sequence of stop. P, T, B. Stop behind. The T in the middle has undergone deletion. Dragged back, rubbed down. Grandmother. We don't say the D in grandmother, but grandmother. And again, after the D is deleted, that brings an N, the alveolar nasal, adjacent to a bilabial nasal, which then triggers place assimilation. So you get grandmother with the bilabial. Handsome, the D doesn't get pronounced. Castle, you know the word castle, but if you've noticed that the T doesn't get pronounced, now you understand why. It's because originally it was castle. 500 years ago, it may have been pronounced castle, but in modern contemporary English, we don't pronounce the T or D when it's between two consonants, between two stops. And then in a cluster, there's some variation by dialects. So in some cases, my dialect includes this, in some cases it doesn't. But the word often, so in my dialect, I don't pronounce the T, it's often. But there are speakers who say often. Right? But it's triggered by consonant clusters, so often. But both are correct. So if you're trying to decide which to pronounce, you don't need to worry about it. Both of them are correct. Often. And it's not as simple as American English and British English. There are some areas of the United States where people say often, and other areas where they say often. And in the UK, there are some speakers that say often, and other speakers who say often. Kindness is variable. Some people delete the D, kind, becomes kindness. But some people in careful speech do still pronounce it. That's because it's between two morphemes, right? The adjective kind and the ending ness. Some people will keep the D in certain dialects. The standard pronunciation is to delete the D in that context. Kindness. Asked, right? Asked, the K, it's deleted, and so you get asked. But some people in very careful speech will make an effort to keep the sequence asked. asked. Here's, this word, close, right? So in my dialect, close has exactly the same pronunciation as close the door, right? Some people very carefully might say clothes, clothes, but don't be fooled by the letter E. The E is only spelling. There are no speakers of English that say clothes, clothes. Right? That's just the wrong form. And if you're pronouncing it that way, there's a good reason. Right? It would make sense because of the spelling, but this E is not pronounced at all. It's just a product of the spelling rule, and in order to represent that, it becomes, it's there, but it's not pronounced. If you want to pronounce the in careful speech, clothes, it's a little bit difficult, but it's not necessary. I think most speakers will produce clothes. Clothes. I'm going to buy some new clothes today. Clothes. But you may sometimes hear clothes. That's the point. So some dialects vary. And the dialects may be regional. The dialects may also be formal compared to casual. There are different variations that might lead to some of these differences. Now, we also have cases of deleting the schwa vowel, which results in reducing the number of syllables in a word. So it's sometimes called syllable deletion or schwa deletion, but in either case, there's an unstressed syllable where the vowel gets deleted. But it's only the vowel. So if the syllable includes a consonant, that consonant joins usually the syllable before, but it could be the syllable after, but it joins one of the other two syllables. Right? So we delete schwa and the syllable that it's in, and the other segments remain in the pronunciation, but they become part of different syllables. So the word family, originally 3 syllables, family, the middle syllable, the second syllable is unstressed, family, so that would be pronounced with a schwa, family. But many speakers delete the schwa and pronounce family, family, family. It's quite a normal pronunciation, family. The same is true for history. History, history, the t, the history, becomes history, history. Deliberate, deliberate, deliberate becomes deliberate. The B joins the syllable before, becomes lib, delib, and then the R becomes rit, deliberate. Interest, originally interest, interest, 3 syllables, interest, is now, by many speakers, interest, interest. Generous, generous is now generous, generous for many speakers. So those are examples of schwa deletion. Always an unstressed syllable. Right? It's only, right, this is, I think, the last one. We also have a case of, the letter H is sometimes confusing in English writing because it's often not pronounced. Right? If it's in an unstressed part of the word, we don't say the h. So the word vehicle, vehicle, although it's spelled with an H, there's no H in the pronunciation, vehicle. However, when we change the stress by adding an ending to create an adjective, like a vehicular accident, vehicular, in the word vehicular, the H is pronounced, which shows us that the H is there in the basic pronunciation, but it's deleted when unstressed. If it's stressed, then it is realized as part of the pronunciation. Vehicular, vehicular. So we can call that H drop or H deletion. It only targets H. Right, so to summarize, we've seen these 3 different types of fluent speech processes that affect segments due to segmental adjacency. Bringing segments next to one another in a sequence of segments triggers changes that make the speech stream more fluid, more fluent. And they've included assimilation, where segments have changed either their place or their voicing to match the place or the voicing of an adjacent segment. In the examples we've seen, voicing assimilation has changed to match the segment before. Place assimilation has changed to match the segment following. Okay? So there have been differences there. Blending was the example of two segments blending into a single segment that combines together features from both original segments. The example we saw joined the place of articulation of one segment with the manner of articulation of the other. And finally, the several examples of deletion, cases where segments don't get pronounced because of the segments that are adjacent to it. Avoiding sequences of basically obstruents that are pronounced difficult to hear, difficult to say, so we don't say them. And then those segmental adjacency changes were just one of the three main types. The other two being stress-triggered fluent speech changes and syllabification changes. Changes triggered by grouping segments into syllables around a sonority peak. And we will study syllables a lot more next semester when we look at how syllables are formed and how we determine stress in words, stress in compounds and phrases, and then finally intonation in speech. But since this semester is basically on segmental phonetics, we're really looking at the individual phonetics, the individual segments. So here I'd like you to test your understanding by some examples. Right? So here we've got sentences that have the triggers for pronunciation changes. And I'll do the first ones for you. Actually, we saw these examples last week. So this is actually repeating the examples we saw. But if you look carefully in the first sentence, eating too much red meat is unhealthy. Well, red ends in a alveolar stop, d, and the following word meat begins with a bilabial nasal. That's the kind of context where we get place assimilation. Right? Red meat. We don't pronounce the D perfectly clearly. It undergoes place assimilation to produce red meat, like a B-like sound, red meat. Do you like cream and sugar in coffee? In coffee. Right? The N of in is generally alveolar, but the K of coffee is velar, so we get a change in the place of articulation. We say in coffee, in coffee. So we want to begin recognizing these phonetic contexts where the changes take place. I think I left it on my desk. In the N of on, followed by the M of my, leads to place assimilation. On my desk. On my desk. And he's great at baseball. At ends with an alveolar stop. That's one of the weak segments that is subject to place assimilation. So what we actually pronounce is at baseball. At baseball. That way the lips are already closed when I start to say the B sound of baseball. At baseball. So these are identifying the targets of assimilation. And in these examples, we're seeing place assimilation. There are other processes happening, right? So think, the K of think is followed by I. So linking takes place. I think I think I, left it, the tit, left it on. So many of these processes occur together in the same sequence of segments. Here we're looking at vowel lengthening. So vowel lengthening occurs when followed by a voiced consonant. So he's got egg on his face. The word egg, egg, ends with a voiced stop, so the e of egg is lengthened. Egg. Not egg, but egg. When will the plane land? Right? Plane, right, has this voiced at the end of plane. That causes the A to be plane, lengthened. But in the case of where will the plate land, plate. So here, plate isn't followed by a voiced vowel, so there's no lengthening in the word plate. But there is in the word land. Right? So both of these are lengthened. But you can hear a difference in the length of the vowel A in plate, plane, plane, plate. The vowel is lengthened before the voiced n. That guy Matt makes me mad. Here the point is to observe the difference between Matt, where the a is followed by t, and the a, which is followed by d. So we lengthen the a in mad, but not in Matt. Matt. So that guy Matt makes me mad. The duration of the a pronunciation is longer in mad than in Matt. That's vowel lengthening. One of the fluent speech processes triggered by syllabification, by grouping the segments into syllables. And some examples from deletion, which we looked at today for the first time. Well, actually, I'll give you a minute. Why don't you look through those words? Oh, actually, did I make a... I noticed on the handout I failed to delete some... yeah, I did. No, that's coming up in a little bit. So for here, take a moment and look for examples of segments that don't get pronounced, that get deleted because of their phonetic context. Just circle the letter that does not get pronounced. So in the first one, Yokohama's landmark tower, landmark, L-A-N-D-M. Three consonants in a row. The D in the middle of landmark doesn't get pronounced. Right? We say landmark, landmark. And then the N undergoes place assimilation, so we actually say landmark. Yokohama's landmark tower. It really doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. The T at the end of doesn't is between the N of doesn't and the M of matter, so we get doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. The N is a good example of a syllabic nasal, right? The Z of does, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Last person to leave the room, please lock the door. last person. Last. The T at the end of last is between a S, a fricative, and another consonant, so we don't pronounce the T. Last person to leave the room, please lock the door. This is the name of a childhood Christmas song. Grandma got run over by a reindeer, so the D of grand, right? The D is not pronounced, grandma. And even the T in the middle of Christmas, right? You've seen it there, and you know that it celebrates a Christian holiday, the birth of Christ. So the T, we understand the meaning, where it comes from, but it doesn't get pronounced. And even when it gets borrowed into other languages, like in Japanese, for example, it's kurisumasu, not kuristomasu. There's no T. Merry Christmas. Even though the original source of the meaning had the T. So here's some more examples. This time we're looking at flapping, where T and D is pronounced as a flap before an unstressed vowel. So again, I'll give you a minute to look at the examples. Identify the T or D that gets pronounced D, like da-di-do, instead of T or D. Okay, so hopefully you caught the word eating. Eating, E is stressed, the ing is unstressed, so that would be a place where we pronounce the flap. Eating, eating. Eating too much red meat is unhealthy. We've seen that sentence before. It really doesn't matter. Matter. The T, oh sorry, oh yeah, there was the meat is. It also occurs between words. Right? So if you have a T before an unstressed word, we also have flapping. Eating too much red meat is unhealthy. Me, de, z, unhealthy. Meat is unhealthy. In number 2, or rather the second one, it doesn't matter. In English, in American English, the words that have the double T in the middle, better, batter, butter, matter, I don't know, others, sadder, are pronounced as a flap. And the point is to notice that it affects both the voiced and voiceless alveolar stops. So in the sentence, I hope he doesn't get any madder, right? Well, there are 2 cases of flapping. There's the double D in matter. Did I fail to mark? There's also the T, right? Get any. Get any. He doesn't get any matter. But what I wanted to highlight is that matter with the T or matter with the D results in the same pronunciation. Although we studied a difference between dialects, where one dialect causes the T to become a flap and then lengthens the vowel if it's voiced. Well, flaps are voiced, so it flaps both cases. There was another dialect where the voicing, the vowel lengthening happened first, in which case only the matter would be lengthened and the matter would not. In that dialect, there's a difference in the vowel length. But in my dialect, when you hear me speak, matter and matter are exactly the same pronunciation, because both voiced and voiceless stops undergo flapping. Sorry, I should have circled the T here, get any. In a sentence like the last one, we have several flaps, right? So said it, said it out, right? He said it out loud. So a sequence of 2 flat segments. Oops, oh, sorry. So looking at that specific example, I can't believe he said it out loud. Right? If I look at the particular segments, there's one new additional change that occurs. The T before another consonant doesn't always undergo deletion because there's not a consonant before it. But in this case, it's changed into this segment. I think I've mentioned it, but we'll study it again. The glottal stop. So there's the T of I can't believe it. The he undergoes H deletion or H drop. We see the flapping of said it out loud. But now there's this, sorry, where did that go? So that's the one we just saw, said it out loud. But this T does not undergo flapping. That's the point. Flapping needs to be followed by a vowel, but it does change, you can see, into a glottal stop. And I mentioned this process of glottal substitution last week. I think I have a slide coming up later. I thought it was on this slide, but that's one more fluent speech change. I can't believe he said it out loud. I can't believe he said it out loud. And here, the contrast between can and can't seems like the difference should be the T. Can't. I can't believe he said it out loud. But since we delete the T in this context, the way that we make clear the difference between the positive can and the negative can't is on the pronunciation of the vowel. Right? We say can versus can. I can, if this is positive, I can believe, the can is reduced, becomes can, I can believe. The negative is not reduced, it's can't, I can't believe. So when we're trying to be clear about whether we said positive can or negative can't, the contrast is not whether the T is there or not. The contrast is in how clearly you pronounce the vowel. So I can believe he said it out loud compared to I can't believe he said it out loud. Can't. Right. So here are a few examples where we get interactions between the different fluent speech processes. So in mustard and ketchup, so I've given you the English spelling, which shows you all the segments we might expect, but I've also given you the fluent sequence of segments. So if you look carefully, you'll see that some segments are missing, some segments are changed. You can figure out the fluent speech processes that have occurred. So you see mustard, so the D is still there, right? But and has been reduced to the N. Right? The A of and is gone, the D of D of and is gone, and there's a K, ketchup. And the has become a schwa from vowel reduction. So mustard and ketchup, the and, because it's a schwa deletion, the schwa has been deleted. It's not mustard'n, but rather mustard'n. And then the N undergoes place assimilation after the D has been deleted because it becomes adjacent to a following voiceless velar stop. Right? So there's a place assimilation. Mustard and ketchup. Mustard and ketchup is a natural fluent production of that. Where'd you meet her? Where'd you meet her? Where did you become where'd you? Where'd you meet her? And meet her, the H of her undergoes deletion. Oh, sorry, I should be adding there's deletion of the, I forgot I added these parts there. So there's both deletion and then place assimilation. In where'd you meet her, there's blending of the did you into j. Right? So the two segments, d, y, become j. And there's also H deletion. The H of her is followed by the unstressed meet her. And then the flapping occurs on the T, because it's now followed by an unstressed vowel. Where'd you meet her? Where'd you meet her? I didn't mark it, but you'll also notice that the E is a little bit lengthened. But that's part of being a tense vowel, and also part of being before a flap. And then landmark tower, we already saw. The D of landmark tower undergoes deletion, but then there's also the place assimilation, where that nasal now is followed by a bilabial. The alveolar nasal is now followed by the bilabial nasal after the D has been deleted, resulting in a context for place assimilation to take place, and you get landmark tower. Landmark tower. So in some cases, one of the phonological processes, or one of these fluent pronunciation changes, can then create a new phonetic context where a different rule may also apply. So we often see deletion produce new segmental adjacency, which can then trigger assimilation or blending, typically assimilation. So these are interactions between the different fluent speech processes. We see it in this example as well. I can't believe you said it out loud. Right? Oh, here's the slide I was remembering. Right? That symbol that looks like a question mark without the dot. That's the key. It must not have the dot. That's the IPA symbol for a glottal stop. The glottis is lower than the pharynx. We learned about the pharyngeal fricative. The space in the throat is the pharynx. Further down, the glottis is what closes your windpipe. It closes access to your lungs to prevent food or water from going, food or drink from going into the lungs. And it's also used to create this speech sound. It's the sound you hear in the middle of uh-oh, uh-oh. Actually, I have that on a slide, I think. Right, glottal stop. Right? It's a stop. Its manner of articulation is stop. Its place of articulation is glottal. People often think it's a voiceless stop, but in fact it's neither voiced nor voiceless because its position can't allow voicing. Right? There's no contrast in voicing for glottal stops. There's no other language with a voiced glottal stop, for example. Because if you close the glottis, you can't vibrate the vocal cords. So I guess in some sense it's voiceless because there's no voicing, but that's not even contrastive. So we don't need just glottal stop. As I've said before, it's the sound you hear when I say uh-oh, uh-oh, or you see it in manga, right? So this chisai that comes at the end. Represents that same sound. Right there. Yeah. We see in fluent speech glottal stop substitution for alveolar stops. And it takes place when the consonant t is before another consonant. As we saw before, out loud, the out loud, I don't pronounce the T, it's replaced by a glottal stop. It also happens at the end of words. Right? So some examples, You see it in the case of button, or here, atmosphere. When I say the word atmosphere, I don't say a P. You could have place assimilation, right? Atmosphere. But many speakers, myself included, place a glottal stop here and say atmosphere, atmosphere, atlas, atlas. These are not in my dialect. I would have a flap here. But there are other dialects that have glottal substitution here for bottle, or matter, what's the matter? I like a bottle of Coke, bottle. We also see it across word boundaries. So at the end of the word, when a T at the end of the word is followed by a consonant at the beginning of the next word, that can also trigger glottal substitution. So get more, got nothing, sit right here, lit one, not you. Now, not you is the environment where you might see blending. The T at the end of not might blend with the y at the beginning of you to produce not you, not you. And some speakers do produce not you, and other speakers will say not you. And to be honest, even the single speaker may, in different contexts, pronounce not you as not you with a glottal stop, and in other situations produce it as not you. So it's not so clear-cut, the division between these processes. Okay. The last topic I will introduce, do I have time for this? Yeah. So since the last segment class we've studied has been the class of obstruents, and obstruents include 3 types of segments: affricates, fricatives, and stops. One characteristic of stops produced in English is called aspiration. And you see that the S-P-I-R, this is the same root of spirit or respiration. It means breath, right? The aspiration means to add breath when you release a stop. So English speakers pronounce voiceless stops with aspiration. It's a kind of burst of air, which I usually demonstrate. I'll try to do this in a COVID-friendly way. Supposed to keep my mask on in the room, but if I let's see. So when I pronounce words that have a voiceless stop at the beginning of a stressed syllable, I pronounce it with this burst of air. And in the IPA, we use this little H. The raised H means the aspiration. And you hear it when it's the first segment in a stressed syllable. You may also hear it at the beginning of the word, regardless of whether it's stressed or unstressed. Otherwise, it's unaspirated. And I want to show you the contrast. And it's another example of allophony. The P or the T or the K have allophones that are aspirated or unaspirated, depending on the phonetic context. So when I say the word park, when you see the paper move, park, it's because my lips close, air pressure builds up in the mouth, and during the release, park. However, for all of them, park, port, apart, important, Pacific. But in the word happy, the next segment, the next vowel is not stressed. So I say happy, there's no burst of air. Soap, lamp. In the word spark, it's not the initial segment in the word. So a contrast between park and spark. And it's not related to the volume of my voice. If I pronounce park, 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 even quietly, park, park, there's this burst of air. But in the case of spark, 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 even loudly pronouncing it doesn't create this aspiration. So it's a natural property of voiceless stops to be pronounced with aspiration when it's the first segment in the word or the first segment of a stressed syllable. So you'll have aspirated T in table, but also attack. In attack, the T is not the first syllable, the first segment of the word, but it does begin a stressed syllable. Sorry, that should have an accent mark on the A. It should be attack. Torpedo, tomato, but hat, stable, store. When there's an S before the stop, so SP, ST, SK, or SC, the stop is pronounced without aspiration. So I get cable and can. And sometimes you'll hear on microphones a kind of pop sound. Or maybe you've seen pictures in recording studios. They use a kind of mesh screen in front of the microphone that is, which is there for a purpose. It absorbs the pop sound created by aspiration. Now, there's also aspiration in the pronunciation of spoken Japanese, but the duration of aspiration is different in different languages. French, for example, has no aspiration. French speakers, they have the P sound and they have the B sound, so there's a contrast between voiceless and voiced. But unlike English pronunciation, French doesn't include aspiration. It's running short of time. Basically, we've seen this kind of allophony before, where the P is pronounced as an aspirated P in one context and unaspirated elsewhere. It's pronounced word initially or stressed syllable initial. And it's the same context for all three voiceless stops. So we can generalize this in a rule based on features, which would be something like voiceless stops become aspirated when they're word initial or stressed syllable initial, and they're unaspirated elsewhere. I won't go into the details of a feature-based account, but I will just show you, we can see this in a recording. Right? So when I record my voice on a computer or an audio recording device, we can measure how much time, how fast or how slow the gap is between releasing my lips or releasing the tongue and the start of my voice for the following segment. We call this gap, this duration, the voice onset time. How much time before the onset of voicing? How many milliseconds? So a millisecond is 1/1000th of a second. So there are 1,000 milliseconds in a second. So it's a very small amount of time. And so we measure the difference in the timing. So we'll see a difference, for example, between the P in park with aspiration, spark without aspiration, and bark, which is a voiced bilabial stop. Actually, I'll show this. I'm running short of time, so I'll show this later, but we can measure how many milliseconds. And the point is it's much longer for the aspirated stop, and it's shorter for the unaspirated stop, and then it's even negative for the voiced stop. Let me show you what that means. So here's my pronunciation of the word park. Park. So this point is the release of the lips. There's a little called a burst. And this noisy part is the sound of the and then here is the ark. Even here you see the release of the K. Ark. Right? And so this duration between the burst, the release of the lips, and the start of the voicing, which is this part, is called the VOT. This particular example measures 83 milliseconds, but generally for English speakers, it's somewhere between 60 and 90 milliseconds. So that's park. This is the arc. But in the word spark, this first part is the s, and then my lips close, so there's basically silence. And then there's this little bit of VOT between the burst and the voicing. So the VOT is much shorter, about 11. In this case, it was exactly 11 milliseconds. But in general, it measures somewhere between 5 and 20 milliseconds. So in both cases, there's the release and then the voice. So VOT is how many milliseconds after the release does the voicing start? Is it 11 milliseconds later? Is it 70 milliseconds later? In the case of voiced sounds, like the B at the beginning of bark, the voicing actually starts first. So when I ask how many milliseconds after the release does the voicing start, well, it doesn't start after. It actually starts before. So in a case like bark, you see the voicing first. That's what this is. This is, in slow motion, kind of bark, bark. Right? And so what you actually see here is a negative VOT. Right? So in this particular recording, I just said the word bark, and it measured 85 milliseconds after the start of voicing do I get this burst. So it's usually somewhere between negative 90 and as many as 5 milliseconds. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but that's we're out of time now, so I'll stop there. That's all there is for, oh sorry, someone was still copying. We'll stop there. Okay, there should be another quiz available on Manaba probably by tonight. I didn't quite get it ready over the weekend, but we'll stop here. That's all there is for today. Have a nice week, a nice weekend, and I'll see you next Monday. Thank you.